just to give you an idea of something that is in formation, it's called the Great American Rail Trail. The idea would be to cross all of America on rails to trails. This section out here in Washington State, starting here on the coast of the Olympic Peninsula, actually, cuts across Washington, and big swaths of it across Washington are complete, including a really neat chunk across the northern Idaho panhandle. I know people that have biked that. Look, there's a big chunk of it done across Nebraska. Or green means it's done. Orange means they're planned. And the gray part is unplanned. It's like someday we'd love to do that. But if you look out here, you can see this is Pittsburgh right here, all the way to Washington. That's complete. That's the longest single completed section of the Great American Rail Trail. What is a rail trail? A rail trail is simply a railroad right-of-way, a line, a railroad track that's been converted into a bike path. And those are superior to almost any other bike path because they built those railroads so well, and the water drains through them. Because that's how the railroads were built. They're very flat. They're very even grade, so they make great paths for bikes. In fact, I think as I talk about it, you'll find out that I love riding on the crushed limestone more than I love riding on asphalt. The Great Allegheny Passage, what we call the GAP, G-A-P, and the C&O Towpath, that's Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Towpath, stretches 335 miles from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. It is probably, in my opinion, the premier rails or trails riding experience in the U.S. There it is on a map. So Pittsburgh, this is orange, is the Great Allegheny Passage, or maybe amber, whatever you want to call that, yellow orange. And then this bright orange is the C&O Towpath. The C&O follows the path of the Potomac River all the way from Cumberland to Washington. The mighty Potomac River. The Great Allegheny Passage, and that was where that, and they built the canal right next to the river the whole way. That's why it's the towpath. That's what the animals walked on when they were towing the canal boats. We'll see more of that later. And then the Great Allegheny Passage is a rails to trail. So this is actually a towpath made into a trail. And the Great Allegheny Passage is several railroad lines. It's the Western Maryland Railroad from Cumberland to Connellsville. And then from Connellsville, it's the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie into Pittsburgh. And this follows the course of rivers its entire way, with one little exception at the very end here. It doesn't follow the course of a river, but it follows first the Monongahela River, one of the mighty rivers that makes up the Ohio, the Allegheny and the Monongahela. And then it picks up outside of Pittsburgh, it picks up the Youghiogheny River, which flows into the Monongahela. And the Yacht goes all the way to past Ohiopyle. And then it picks up another river and follows that past Myersdale. Then it follows some creeks and things. And then at the very end, it kind of cuts through a mountain path. So we'll follow this a little bit more. This is an interesting thing. And this looks exhausting if you see it, but if you realize this is 335 miles, well, it's got almost 330 there, 50, doesn't it? It is you're climbing, but it is imperceptibly because it's basically flat. So you start at elevation 600 feet in Pittsburgh. Let's say you can go either direction. You could start in Washington and go to Pittsburgh, and you could start in Pittsburgh and go to Washington, or Washington and start and go to Pittsburgh. But in Washington, D.C., of course, is at sea level. The Potomac is a tidal river in Washington. That's why they built these major rivers all along the fall lines of the rivers, these major cities along the fall lines of the rivers. That's what Washington, D.C. is. So it's at zero, and Pittsburgh's at 600 feet above sea level. And if you head east, the Great Allegheny Passage, the Gap, goes on a gentle climb, again, imperceptible, till you get to the Eastern Continental Divide, where you're at just short of 2,400 feet, or about, it's at about 400 some meters. No, 800 meters. And then it drops at about a 1.5% to 2% grade all the way to Cumberland. Again, that looks steep. You actually don't have to pedal very hard if you're going this direction. And then when you get to Cumberland, you are, well, Pittsburgh's 720 feet. So I say 600. Cumberland is 605 feet. So you kind of go up and then all the way back down a little bit low where you started. And then the Potomac, which the C&O Towpath, by the way, is longer than the Gap. It's 180 miles, 185 miles, whereas the Great Allegheny Passage is about 150. It is just following the river in a very, very, very gentle course all the way in. The Great Allegheny Passage and the C&O Towpath really are about rivers, railroads, and mountains. And that is my youngest son back when he was just 12, biking with me the whole section from Cumberland here to Pittsburgh. So we went this direction. He climbed this, a 2% grade, all the way up to the Eastern Continental Divide and went all the way to Ohiopyle, 75 miles in about 8 hours. That's a view of the river in Ohiopyle. That is the Eastern Continental Divide. So that on the west side of this, where I'm standing, is all the water and the creeks and the rivers and everything flow to the Mississippi Valley through the Ohio River. So they go through, they head toward Pittsburgh, and then they take the Ohio River to the Mississippi and out to the Gulf of Mexico. The other side, the east, they flow east eventually into the Potomac and end up in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's the Eastern Continental Divide. Railroads, there's a railroad museum in Myersdale, PA. That's the old C&O, Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. So there was a railroad as well as a canal. I'll tell you a little bit of that story later. But so they're great to learn about the museums. This is just past the Eastern Continental Divide, heading east, and that's what's called the Narrows, a deep cut, natural cut in the rock, a gorge that, and you can't quite tell, but just through this is Cumberland, Maryland. I started my trip all from Pittsburgh to Washington the Saturday of Labor Day weekend in 2020. I spent a week cycling it from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. I should mention, I lived near the Great Allegheny Passage for decades and watched its development and growth from just a 10-mile path from Ohiopyle to Confluence, PA, through the Ohiopyle State Park. I watched, that was the first section that was open, to the entire 150-mile section, and have biked all or part of it numerous times. I used to lead tours on it just from Pittsburgh to Cumberland or Cumberland to Pittsburgh. So I know it well, but I always had the ambition someday to start in Pittsburgh and go all the way to Washington. I usually stopped in Cumberland, so I didn't get the whole way. While I was going, I stayed in a mixture of lodgings, from Airbnb to bed and breakfast to hotels. This is a really nice famous inn up on the Allegheny Ridge, which, as you might guess, since it was on the top of the ridge, I didn't in this case bike there, because the owner came down with a shuttle and picked us up and brought us all the way back up to the inn at the top of the mountain. My cost per day was about $100, which included buying my own food for breakfast and lunches when I needed to. I have lived within a few miles or a few hours of the Gap since it was first begun in 1986. And as I said before, I've ridden parts of it more times than I can count. And I've been a guide on the Gap for Road Scholars. If you've heard Road Scholars, I've been the guide for that trip along the Great Allegheny Passage. And I decided to pedal it in 2020, September 2020, because I was looking for a safe way to make a trip.